Welcome to the Board Game Network. This is James. I'm going to be explaining how to play this game called Twilight Struggle. It has got a super high rating on Board Game Geek. It's one of the top rated GMT type war game games out there. And it's not really just a war game. It's really much broader than that. It deals with the 45-year struggle between 1945 and 1989 of the Cold War. It was designed by Ananda Gupta and Jason Matthews. And I'm going to be talking about the deluxe edition. It came out in 2015, so there are earlier versions that might be slightly different in the rules and stuff. It takes about 2 hours to play. It's a two-player game. And it deals with the dance between the Soviet Union and the US. Now I've got it already set up here. I've got it set up so the US is over here and Russia, USSR is over here. USSR gets a China card that's face up. Everybody, the other two players are dealt 8 cards. Now there's actually 3 different decks. There's an early war deck, there's a mid-war, and a late war. So you shuffle them separately. And they get mixed in at different times. So you're just going to shuffle the early war and then deal out 8 to each player. You have starting influence in countries around the world, both superpowers here. So it gives you where those are set up in the rule book, but they also put a little notation on the board. There's a 2 in blue on the left side of Canada, so United States puts a 2 marker there. And if this number is not as big as this number here, it goes on the white side with the blue star. If this number is as big or bigger than this number, then it goes on the blue side with the white star. So we just look around the board, and United States goes on the left, USSR goes on the right. So that's the way this is all set up here. You've got the white with the red hammer and sickle, or the red with the yellow hammer and sickle. Okay. You also have an action round marker that goes with the Soviet side up on the action round track. You've got a turn marker goes up here. You've got space race markers for both countries here. You've got required military operations. You've got a US counter and a USSR counter here. You've got a DEFCON status marker that starts on 5. You've got a victory point marker that starts in 0. And the victory point track, it just goes toward or away. So you're not keeping 2 separate scores. You're just keeping a relative score between the 2 countries. So if US gets victory points, it's going to go to the right and then would lap down here. If USSR gets points, it's going to come back this way towards the USSR victory. And they do a great job of giving you little notations around the board. Here's the sequence of play here. Here is what happens during the turns. Here's what happens during the space race. These dark lines here show adjacent countries. If there's dotted lines, that shows between regions. So this Iran is adjacent to Afghanistan, but that's considered 2 different regions. The dark black line is adjacent to a superpower. So United States and USSR really aren't in this game. They are just superpowers, and then all the other ones are connected to them. Now there are some influence tokens that are not specified at the beginning of the game. You'll notice here it says 7 for the US anywhere in Western Europe. Western Europe is the dark purple, and Eastern Europe is the light purple. So if something says Eastern Europe, it's just the light purple. If something says Western, it's the dark purple. If something says Europe, then it's both. And you'll notice that there's a Southeast Asia here, and there's an Asia. So these ones with the slash across them or the slash across them here, they actually count as both. Finland is Western Europe and Eastern Europe. Malaysia is Asia and Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asia is a sub-region of Asia. So if something just says Southeast Asia, you're just talking about that part. If you're saying Asia, then it's both parts. So USSR has to set up first on this, and they get 6 anywhere in Eastern Europe. So let's just say we took Poland and, I don't know, come down to Bulgaria. And US gets 7 anywhere in Western Europe. So let's grab France, Turkey, and I don't know, Italy. Okay, then we're set up and ready to go. Adjacent countries connect via lines. So you'll notice, like right here, Jordan is adjacent to Lebanon by a line, even though the boxes aren't next to each other. You'll notice Turkey is actually part of Western Europe by the color, and it's connected to Greece, which is connected to Italy. So these are politically Western Europe, not necessarily geographically Western, because Turkey's over in the east, but it's aligned with Western Europe. Anytime it talks about influence, that's these markers here, and anytime you have markers on a country, then you have influence in that country. The word control means you have at least enough influence that you've got this number here, and you have this much more than the opponent has. So if USSR had 1 influence in France and the United States had 3 influence, then US would not control France. US would have to go to 4 influence to control France, 3 bigger than whatever the opponent has to control a country. And there's a reference here that talks about different things, and here's a little reference right here that talks about controlling countries. It's considered controlled if the player has influence points in the country greater than or equal to the opponent's stability number. This is your stability number right here. And the player's influence in the control exceeds his opponent's influence in that country by at least the country's stability number. So you have to have at least that much more than your opponent. Now you notice some of these are in blue, a blue background, white text for the country, and some of them are yellow. And then the stability number is got a red background, whereas some of them have a yellow background. The ones with a red background to the number and a blue background for the country, those are battleground countries. This game lasts up to 10 rounds. Here's your 10th round here, so you keep track of your turns here. And so if you get to round 10, then that's the end of the game right there. Now let's follow along on the sequence of play here. You increase the DEFCON status. Well, at the beginning of the game you're starting at 5, so you can't really increase it, but if you were down farther towards nuclear war, then it goes up 1 space at the beginning of each round. Then you deal cards, and you bring your hand size back up to 8. So no matter how many cards you've played during that last round, you're going to get dealt back up to 8, and that does not count the China card. This China card goes back and forth between the players, and anytime you have to discard or you get dealt cards, this does not count in your hand size. It's not part of your hand. This is for turn 1, 2, and 3. You go to 8. For turns 4 through 10, you actually get 9 cards. And then the third step is playing the headline phase. And the headline phase, both of you play a card face down. Now these cards have 2 different things you can do with them. You can play them as an operations number in the upper left-hand corner, or you can play them as an event, whatever it says on them. Now this upper left star tells you whether this event is beneficial to USSR or the United States, If it's a white star with a blue outline, that's United States. If it's a red star with a yellow outline, that's USSR. You might even see some that have a half and half, half red, half white, and so that can be beneficial to either player. And then you'll see some that don't have any number at all, and those are scoring cards, and they score different regions of the board based on who has presence or control or domination. So during the headline phase here, you're going to pick out some card that you want to play. And so I'm just going to throw a card down here, and USSR is going to throw a card down. And this happens simultaneously. You flip them over. Whoever has the highest operations number goes first. So USSR played a 3, US played a 1. If there was a tie, then US goes first, and you cannot play the China card during the headline phase. If you play a scoring card, one of those that does not have a point value up here, that counts as a 0 for the operations number for turn order. And then you have to play the event. You cannot play it as an operation. So this one says the Truman Doctrine, remove all USSR influence markers in one uncontrolled country in Europe. So Europe is all of Europe, and remove all USSR influence in one uncontrolled. So a controlled one is one that's flipped over to the dark side, the dark red background, and those just flip back and forth based on whether you have control, just to help you visually see whether you have control or not. There's no magic to it. So let's just say, oh, I don't know, I want Iraq. So we removed all of the influence from a one uncontrolled country in Europe. And then this one has an asterisk by it, and it says at the bottom, removed from play if used as an event. So it has been used as an event, so it actually goes out of the game. Otherwise, you just discard the cards and to over here, and then they get reshuffled back in. So that one is out of the game permanently. And USSR played Warsaw Pact formed. It's got an asterisk also. It says remove all US influence from 4 countries in Eastern Europe, or add 5 USSR influence in Eastern Europe, adding no more than 2 per country, and it allows the play of NATO. NATO can't be played until this one's played, so this one allows the playing of a later card. And that's why it's got an underline under the text, is to show that it stays out. There's some effect that continues on once this card's been played, even though it's considered out of the game with the asterisk. So I would remove all US influence in 4 different countries, or add 5 USSR influence in Eastern Europe here. And then so that one would then be off to the side out of the game. And the point of the headline phase is it forces you to play events from your cards. Whereas once you come down into the action rounds, you can play as operations or events, but you're not forced into playing the events at that point. So once we drop into action rounds, you cannot hold scoring cards to the next turn. So I have an Asia scoring. So once you keep in track of your turn track, and it becomes the next turn, you cannot have an Asia scoring left in your hand. So once it goes to turn 2, you have to dump them all before that point. You have 6 action rounds for turns 1, 2, and 3, and you have 7 for 4 through 10. Remember, you get 1 extra card dealt to you in turns 4 through 10. During the action rounds, USSR goes first, and then you just alternate back and forth. And this helps you keep track of whose round it is. It's got hammer and sickle on one side. It's got the star on the other side. So we're starting out with USSR, and then when he's done, flips over to United States, and then it flips over and goes to action round 2, and then United States, 3, until it gets down to 6, and then the United States, and then that signals the end of the round. If you run out of cards during that round, you just simply don't play anymore. But the other player continues to play. Then you check military operations status. And what you do with military operations status is you'll do things that require the military to come into play. And so that will move your marker. And DEFCON will also change. So at this point, check military operations status. You really need to have your military to be a number as big as the DEFCON. So if DEFCON is at 3 and you're at 2, you actually lose 1 victory point. Anybody who has less than a military status less than the DEFCON level subtracts that much. And remember, the victory point track is just off, it just is relative to each other. So let's say USSR had a 4, or US has a 4, USSR has a 2, and DEFCON's at 3. Well, you would not subtract from US because US has greater than or equal to the DEFCON, so you don't subtract from US. But USSR has 1 less than the DEFCON, so US would get 1 victory point. And then the military operations tokens go back to 0 at that point. The next step is reveal held cards. And any cards you hold, that just says for tournament only. And the reason for that is you can't hold those scoring cards. And so that is to help verify that you don't have a scoring card in your hand. That's the only purpose for it. So typically you're not going to do that in friendly play. Then you flip the China card. If the China card is face down, then you flip it face up. You cannot play the China card unless it's face up. So when you use it, it goes to your opponent face down. And then on the next turn, it gets flipped face up so he can use it. And so you might hold on to it for 2 or 3 turns or longer, and then you use it and it goes face down. And then during this phase, it goes face up. You advance the turn marker 1 space at this point, and then after turn 10 only, you have the final scoring. You'll notice here, once you get to turn 4, it makes a note here, add mid-war cards. So you're just going to take the mid-war cards and shuffle them into your draw deck, and you do not shuffle in your discards unless they are needed. But you're going to shuffle the mid-war into the early war, and then you start your 7 actions, and then once you get up to 8, you're going to shuffle in the late war into the deck. So they all end up, the deck ends up getting bigger because you've got the early war, the mid war, and the late war in the same deck. Okay, so going back to the 4th phase here, the action round, we're going to talk about how cards get played. We're going to talk about the 2 different ways that you can play cards. You can play as an event or as an operations. Let's talk about operations first. So you're just using these numbers up in the upper left-hand corner, and that allows you to do things. So let's say I want to put influence out in Western Europe or anywhere. I can discard this and put down 4 influence. So I can add to ones that are already there. I can add to adjacent ones. I cannot just pick Nigeria and throw something in Nigeria. I don't have anything adjacent to Nigeria, so I can't do that. There are cards that allow me to put influence down anywhere, but as a general rule, it either has to be in the same space you're already in, or it has to be in an adjacent space. Now, if this card that you're using as operations has an event on it that benefits your opponent, then the event still happens. So let's say I want to discard my decolonization card to get 2 influence. Well, this decolonization still works because it benefits USSR. And it says add 1 USSR influence in each of 4 African and or Southeast Asian countries. Okay. Me being the active player, or what the rulebook calls the phasing player, I can choose, do I want to put mine down first, take my influence and put it down first, or allow USSR to go first? Sometimes it makes a difference, especially if he gets to remove tokens and you're going to put down tokens. You want him to go first a lot of times so you can see what he takes off and then you can put it back on. Okay, now that event still happens. So if it's a one-time event, like the Formosan resolution, if USSR played this and it benefits the United States, then it would still happen and it would get discarded out of the game because it's got an asterisk after it. So that event happens, just as if the United States had played it. If there's an asterisk on it, but it cannot be played for some reason, if it can't happen, maybe it's a card that requires a previous card to have been played, so it can't happen, then it stays in the it goes to the discard pile and stays in the deck. It does not get removed even though it's got the asterisk. Now when you're placing influence down, if you're putting influence in a space that's already controlled by your opponent, it actually costs 2 to place a single point down, whereas normally it just costs 1. So you'll see here that I've got Turkey, which is adjacent to Bulgaria. So if I wanted to put influence here, putting a single influence marker down would cost me 2 points. So that way, if I discarded Formosan resolution to get 2 influence points, I could only put 1 point counter down for that, because Bulgaria is already controlled, and then Bulgaria would flip over to be non-controlled at that point. So any further points I could put down only cost me 1 because it's no longer controlled by USSR. Now there's different ways of taking over countries from other people, from the opponent. You've got realignment roles, and then here's a little reference on realignment roles. The purpose is to reduce enemy influence in a country. And the condition is your opponent must have influence in that country. The cost is 1 operations point. So if I discarded Formosan resolution and said I want to do a realignment, that only costs 1 and I have 2, so I could actually do this twice. Each player rolls a dice and you add 1 for each controlled adjacent country. So each country that's adjacent to the country that's happening in, you get +1 on your die roll. You get +1 if it's adjacent to the rolling player's superpower, and you get a +1 to the rolling player if they have more influence in the country than the opponent. So in the case of Bulgaria, if I was doing a realignment, I would not get that +1 because I don't have more than USSR does there. Once you do the die rolls, then you adjust the influence based on the difference between the totals, and then you'd go around and use the next point. You get to see how 1 turns out before you go on and use further ones. So if you have 2 or 3 in a row, then you do 1, you do another one, you do another one, and if you use 1 realignment point, all of the rest has to be used for realignment. You can't use it for something else. Another way of affecting the change in composition of a country is to do a coup. And a coup works differently. It costs a card instead of an operations point. So I could discard this for my whole coup attempt. And what you do is you take a die roll and add this operations number, and it has to be greater than the stability number times 2. So let's go back and let's put Bulgaria here. I'm going to take me off. And the stability number is 3. So 2 times 3 is 6. I would have to roll a die 5 plus 2 is 7. Subtract this, and it is greater than 6. So I would remove the difference. So I would end up removing 1 influence from USSR from Bulgaria. That's how a coup works. And you do add friendly influence if the difference is high enough. When you do a coup, if the coup is in a battleground country, that affects the DEFCON status and takes it 1 to the right. So that takes you closer to war when that happens. If you ever get to nuclear war, whoever the active player is, whoever the phasing player is, he's the one that loses. No matter who caused it to go to DEFCON 1, whoever's turn it is actually loses the game. Now, something you can do with your card also is to adjust the space race. And to do that, you discard a card, and this shows you that it has to be a 2 ops or greater. And then you roll a dice, and it says on a 1 to 3 it's successful. So 50% of the time it's not going to be successful. And then that would move your counter there. And then if you get to certain ones, they let you do certain things. Now, if you discard an opponent's event, it does not happen. And it simply goes to the discard pile, so it didn't happen. So even if it's got an asterisk, it doesn't happen. So that's a way of getting an opponent's events out of your hand without actually the opponent getting the benefit from them. The number here is, there's a 2/1 on the first space. So whoever gets there first, you'll notice it says up here, whoever gets there first gets 2 victory points. Whoever gets there, if the other player gets there, then he gets 1 victory point. So you'll notice there's victory points along there. And any of these special abilities that are listed down here, they only happen for the first player to get there. If the second player gets there, then the special ability goes away. Now, that's how operations works. I've gone through all of the different options for operations. Now, events, they just happen according to whatever the text is, and the operations number doesn't matter usually. And then remember, if it's an asterisk, you're going to discard it out of the game. If it's underlined, then it affects the rest of the game unless it gets discarded at some point and taken out. So operations and events. That's the 2 different ways of playing your cards, and then you go back and forth and back and forth. Let me talk about the China card. The China card says on it, begins the game with the USSR player, and it gives +1 operations value when all points are used in Asia, passed to the opponent after play. So it already starts with a 4 operations value. So if I simply put influence down in Asia completely, then it becomes a 5. So it's +1 VP for the player holding this at the end of turn 10. So whoever has it at the end of the game gets a +1 victory point. When you move up your DEFCON status, you'll notice that there are limitations that happen once the DEFCON gets moved up. This says no coup or realignment attempts in Europe when you get to 4, or in Asia when you get to 3, or in the Middle East when you get to 2. So these are cumulative. So if you get to 2, you can't have coup or realignment attempts in any of those. And you can put these little markers out here to note that there's no coup attempts in whichever countries that are affected, just as a reminder. Now, regional scoring. Regional scoring actually is noted up here. There's presence, domination, and control. And you do have a summary over here. Down here in the scoring summary, it says presence. Control 1 or more countries in the region. So you have to have control to have presence. You have, for domination, you have to control more countries than your opponent and more battleground countries than your opponent. and you must control at least one non-battleground country for you to have domination. To have control of the whole region, now this is not the same as control of the country, this is control of the region. You have to control more countries, and you have to have all the battleground countries. You have to control all the battleground and have more control than your opponent. Then you get 1 victory point per controlled battleground country in the region. And you're going to get 1 victory point for controlled country adjacent to the enemy superpower. So you're going to look at this, and both people are going to score. Both superpowers are scoring. So one of you may have presence and the other one have domination. So you would, and you don't get both. If you have domination, you don't get presence and domination. You just get domination. So let's say USSR has presence and US has domination, then you're going to move the VP counter 2 towards the US because of the difference between the two. So let me talk about the two bonuses. The +1 victory point per controlled battleground. So for every battleground country that you actually control, you're going to get a +1 to your victory point total. And if you have a victory, you get a victory point for controlled country adjacent to the enemy superpower. So if you and the ones that are adjacent are this dark line here. So if US controlled Romania during a scoring of Europe, then US would get a +1 to the victory points because they control a country that is adjacent to the superpower, the enemy's superpower. And that scoring happens when you play a scoring card like this, Asia scoring, and then it shows you the number of points, and it shows you the bonuses also on there. So different regions score differently. And you'll notice control for Europe. If you control Europe and then Europe scores, you actually win the game. So you don't even finish the game at that point. You go ahead and win. So at the end of the game, what happens is the game ends if you ever control Europe and it scores. The game ends if one of you gets to 20 victory points, and then that person immediately wins. As long as all of the scoring has been scored, you can't, like in the middle of some scoring where somebody gets some score and then somebody else gets some score, you have to wait for it to finish. And then if you're at 20, then you win. If the DEF CON level gets to 1, then whoever the current player is, he loses. And at the end of turn 10, all of the regions score. Now Southeast Asia has a scoring card that is separate, but it's not going to score separately from Asia. You're just going to score all of Asia, score all of Europe, score the Middle East, score Africa, score Central America, score South America at the end of the last turn. And that is how you play Twilight Struggle. I know there's a lot of details in there. The trickiest part is knowing the terminology for presence, domination, and control, how that all works, and some of that kind of stuff. But this is a super great game. If you like, it's not even a hardcore war game. It's not like Axis and Allies or Risk or something, or a GMT game where you go out and do a lot of battling. It's really about the political back and forth between US and USSR that happened from this era, and the things that affected the war and the likelihood of a nuclear war. So if you like two-player war games, definitely try this one out. It's a great game. So make sure you tune into all of our videos here at the Board Game Network. Make sure you subscribe too. That really helps us out, and we appreciate when you subscribe and when you watch all of our videos. So tune in And like us on Facebook also.